In Tampa, Florida, the sun doesn't just shine, it issues a formal claim of ownership over your body. The air here is so thick you could spread it on bread, and thunderstorms arrive on a schedule, like grumpy relatives showing up for lunch. But for David, Tampa was the perfect place, because here there was the sky, a vast, shamelessly blue mirror that reflected his hopes. David worked at Candy Bar Aviation LLC. It wasn't a confectionery factory, though the name might mislead you. It was a place where steel birds were born. Massive hangars, smelling of metal and ambition, stood near the coast. David was a mechanic. He was the kind of man who could tell what a designer was thinking last Thursday just by the sound of a bolt being tightened. He had a pilot's license, carefully kept in a leather wallet, and a dream that weighed exactly as much as a used light-engine Cessna. He didn't want to save the world, he just wanted to break away from it by a few thousand feet and fly to a place where he didn't have to pay taxes or answer stupid questions. The work of a mechanic is the art of seeing a malfunction before it becomes a catastrophe. Checking the landing gear, calibrating sensors, ensuring the hydraulics don't decide to take a rest at an altitude of 10,000 meters. But David had another duty, one almost philosophical. He was the guardian of the perimeter. He had to ensure that living nature didn't collide with the mechanical. Birds, they love airfields, perhaps because they also consider them their own. And then, one day, amidst the endless drone of engines and the heat haze rising from the concrete, David found a nest. It was where it shouldn't have been, dangerously close to the runway, in a zone the bosses had ordered to be cleared. David wasn't the type to cry over kitten videos. At 36, you already know the world is harsh, but when he looked into that jumble of twigs and saw a raven chick, clumsy, naked, consisting of nothing but a giant beak in desperation, something inside him clicked, like a sensor that suddenly hit its limit. There were no parents. There was only the scorching Florida sun and an executive order. David sighed. He took the chick. That is how either big problems or big stories begin. In his case, it was both. At home, the chick turned into a screaming black ball of needs. David named him Tom. And suddenly, the life of a lonely mechanic, whose schedule was written down to the minute of technical regulations, turned into chaos. Tom didn't just grow, he studied. He watched David with bead-like eyes that seemed to reflect an intelligence far older than all of aviation combined. His colleagues at Candy Bar Aviation, of course, didn't miss a chance to poke fun. "Hey Dave, how's your partner? Did he poop on the civil aviation manual again?" They'd laugh in the break room. But David just shrugged. He saw what they didn't. He saw Tom learning to open latches, how he imitated the sound of the microwave, and how he, damn it, absolutely loved butter. Butter became their common language. For a piece of cold, yellow luxury, Tom was ready to sell his soul, if he had one, or at the very least, fetch David's keys. It all started with those $2 left by the entrance. David just wanted to test a theory. He placed the bills next to the keys. Tom approached, tilted his head, looked at the money, then at the fridge where the butter lived, and made a choice. He brought the paper in his beak and froze, waiting for his reward. "You realize this is called corruption, Tom?" David asked, slicing a piece of butter. The raven answered with a short croak and swallowed the bribe. Soon, David noticed their union turning into something more. He began taking Tom outside. A massive, iridescent black raven on the shoulder of a mechanic in oil-stained coveralls. It was a sight worthy of Tampa legends. People turned their heads. Tom sat proudly, like an admiral on a bridge, intently studying the world beyond the apartment. And then, David started leaving the window open. Tom sat on the windowsill, looking at the city, at the cafes below, at the people who left slips of paper on tables in exchange for coffee. His sharp eye recorded the details. He understood. These papers were the key to the butter, and the world around him was full of these papers. Part 2. Tax inspection with feathers. In Tampa, everyone has their own way of surviving under this sun. Some sell hurricane insurance, some sell fake tans, and some just hope the AC in their old Ford lasts another week. David didn't plan on becoming a criminal mastermind in the avian world. It happened the way all important things happen, slowly and then all at once. One day, Tom flew away. The window was open and damp air crawled in, smelling of salt and heated asphalt. David stood at his workbench, sorting through parts of an old attitude indicator, and suddenly felt the silence. That specific silence that happens when someone who usually grumbles or flaps their wings leaves the room. David waited 3 hours. He managed to wash his coffee mug 3 times, read the Cessna operating manual twice, and once seriously wondered if he had lost his mind by bonding with a bird. And then a shadow fell on the windowsill. Tom was back. He looked a bit disheveled, like a man who had just run a marathon through a mall clearance sale. Clutched in his beak was a $5 bill. It was slightly damp, perhaps from bird spit, or perhaps from someone's spilled latte on a seaside cafe terrace. Tom placed the money on the table, walked to the fridge, and made a sound that required no translation from Raven. It was the sound of a business partner who had fulfilled his end of the contract and was demanding dividends. "Where did you get this, Tom?" David asked, looking at the 5 as if it could speak. Tom just blinked. His black eyes shone with absolute honesty. From a Raven's perspective, the world is a place where things are left unattended. If a person leaves a piece of paper on a table and goes for sugar, it means the paper is no longer needed by anyone. This wasn't theft, it was resource optimization.
David gave him the butter. That evening, Tom brought $10. Within a week, it became a system. David found out that nearby, on the waterfront, there were several popular cafes. People in Tampa loved to sit outside, drink iced coffee, and leave tips directly on small metal tables. To a Raven that had completed a course in money for butter, these tables looked like free snack dispensers. But Tom wasn't just smart, he was ambitious. A month later, he brought a partner. She was a slightly smaller Raven with smoother feathers and a gaze that held a clear distrust of humanity. David named her Becky. At first, Becky just sat on an oak branch outside the window and watched as Tom entered the apartment, laid a bill on the table, and received a piece of golden butter. On the 3rd day, greed triumphed over caution. And so, David had 2 employees. Mornings at Candy Bar Aviation now began for David with a slight sense of guilt. He was repairing planes meant to lift people into the sky, while at the same time, his air fleet was busy redistributing finances in the city center. By the middle of the month, the income stabilized. The Ravens proved to be incredibly efficient workers. They didn't take sick leave, they didn't need insurance, and they didn't complain about the heat. They only needed butter, lots of butter, the best, salted, farm-style butter. Every evening, when the sun began to sink into the Gulf of Mexico, painting the sky in colors of ripe orange, David sat at the table and counted the take. $200, $250, $300. It was madness. It was illegal. It was surprisingly pleasant. David started a separate shoebox on which he wrote "Wings of Freedom." In it, the money for the plane accumulated. His dream, which used to seem as distant as the North Star, now possessed a very concrete smell, the smell of crisp bills and milk fat.
His colleagues at work began to notice the changes. "Dave, why are you so happy?" a senior mechanic asked once, wiping his hands with a rag. "Did you win the lottery? Or did that Raven start laying golden eggs?" "Something like that," David answered evasively. He felt like he was living in 2 worlds at once. In one world, he was an ordinary mechanic in blue coveralls who knew how a turbine worked. In the other, he was the captain whose black scouts patrolled the city, collecting tribute from careless coffee drinkers. He often thought about how the birds didn't understand the value of these papers. To them, it was just a complex way to get food. But for David, it was the chance to finally stop looking at the sky from the bottom up. But one evening, everything changed. Tom returned later than usual. Becky had long been asleep on top of the wardrobe, beak tucked under her wing, but Tom was nowhere to be found. David paced the room nervously, checking his watch. When the familiar flapping of wings was heard, he exhaled with relief. Tom landed on the table, but didn't demand butter right away. He looked puzzled. In his beak was a $20 bill, folded in four. David took it to smooth it out and put it in the box, but he froze. On the white field of the bill, right over Jackson's portrait, written in neat, almost calligraphic handwriting, was Sarah, 813-555-0192. Please tell me you aren't just a bird thief. David sat down. The heart in his chest started thumping as if one of its cylinders had suddenly failed. Tom looked at him, head tilted, and in his bead-like eyes, David saw for the first time not just hunger for butter, but something resembling irony. "Damn it, Tom," David whispered. "What have you done?"
Part 3. The phone number and other heart breakdowns. In Tampa, there is a kind of heat that makes the thoughts in your head melt and stick together like toffees forgotten in a pocket. On such days, it feels like even time slows down to keep from overheating. David sat in the kitchen, and before him on the table lay the $20 bill. It smelled of perfume, something light like sea breeze and lemon, and it was covered in neat handwriting. David was a mechanic. He understood how flaps worked, why an engine ran hot, and how to fix a leak in the hydraulics. Mechanics is a world of cause and effect. If something is broken, it means there is a part that needs replacing. But there was no mechanics in this bill. There was magic in it, and David disliked magic. It couldn't be calibrated. Tom sat on the back of the chair, looking at David. In his black eye reflected all the irony of the world. "You realize this is a trap, don't you?" David asked the bird. Tom let out a short croak and looked pointedly at the refrigerator door. He didn't care about phone numbers. He needed butter. David didn't call for 3 days. He went to work at Candy Bar Aviation, checked landing gears, listened to the drone of turbines. But that inscription was always before his eyes. "Sarah, tell me you aren't just a bird thief." On the 4th day, when the sun in Tampa decided to finally turn the city into a frying pan, David gave in. He dialed the number, pressing the phone to his ear with an oil-stained shoulder. His heart beat in the rhythm of a faulty piston. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was soft, with that exact intonation that makes men straighten their backs. "Hi, this is the owner of the bird thief," David exhaled. Silence followed. It was so long that David had time to wonder if he should just hang up and move to Oregon. And then Sarah laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, it was warm, like the morning sun on a plane's wing. "I knew it!" she exclaimed. "I saw him 3 times. He arrives at the Blue Anchor at exactly 10 in the morning. He's so determined, but he has a completely gangster look." They agreed to meet at that very cafe. David arrived 10 minutes early. He felt like an idiot. What was he supposed to say? "Hi, I'm a mechanic, and I taught a raven to steal your money so I could save up for a plane?" It sounded like a confession that usually ends with calling the police or the paramedics. Sarah turned out to be exactly what her voice promised. She had blonde hair, perpetually ruffled by the wind from the Gulf, and eyes the color of a stormy Florida sky. She worked as a graphic designer, and unlike David, she didn't see bolts and nuts in the world, but lines and meanings. "So, butter?" she asked when David, stuttering, explained Tom's reward system. Yes, he'd sell his country for it, and apparently your tips. "It's the most honest business model I've encountered in this city," she smiled. That evening, they walked along the waterfront for a long time. Tom and Becky circled somewhere high above, their black silhouettes barely visible against the sunset sky. David told her about planes, about how the sky smells at 3,000 feet, and about his dream, a small Cessna waiting for him somewhere in the future. And Sarah told him about how people in Tampa run too fast and never look up, and that if it hadn't been for a raven so brazenly snatching her bill right off the table, she would never have noticed the man who knows how to heal steel wings.
Thus began their romance. It was a strange time, a time when David, for the first time in 36 years, realized there was room for a co-pilot in his cockpit. Tom and Becky seemed to approve of the choice. Now they brought not only money, but small souvenirs, bright hairpins, shiny candy wrappers, and once someone's sunglasses, which David secretly returned to the lost and found. The income grew. The Wings of Freedom box grew heavier. But the more money the Ravens brought, the more often David thought about how freedom isn't just flight. Freedom is when you have somewhere to return to after it. "You'll fly away soon, won't you?" David asked Sarah one evening as they sat on his balcony watching the city lights. "Me? No." She shook her head and rested it on his shoulder. "But your birds, they're becoming more and more independent. You understand, David, you can't keep them on the staff of your bank forever." David looked at Tom, who was preening his feathers on the railing. The raven looked grown up. There was nothing left of that clumsy chick from the nest by the runway. He was the master of this sky. And David suddenly realized that their contract with the butter was coming to an end. Birds don't need money. They wouldn't even need the butter soon. They needed something David couldn't give them within the four walls of his apartment. Part 4. The Mechanics of Change and Silence in the Sky. In Tampa, they say a hurricane isn't what knocks your house down, but what forces you to build it anew. David didn't have a hurricane. He had a shoebox full of crumpled bills smelling of coffee, women's perfume, and bird beaks. When the Wings of Freedom box finally held enough to buy a used but sturdy Piper, David didn't feel triumph. He felt silence. Because a dream is a very convenient thing as long as it remains a dream. It warms you on cold evenings when you eat your dinner alone. But when it turns into a piece of aluminum on an airfield, it begins to demand responsibility. David bought the plane, blue and white, with a small rust spot on the left wing that he, of course, cured on the very first evening. He quit Candy Bar Aviation. His colleagues threw him a farewell dinner where Tom sat on the chandelier and kept a close eye to make sure no one ate an extra piece of butter. The senior mechanic shook David's hand and said, "You're the only one of us, Dave, who actually got off the concrete. Good luck to you." But the real changes began later. Sarah lived in a small house with a veranda covered in bougainvillea on the other side of town. It didn't smell of kerosene there, but of fresh paint and hope. One evening, as they were packing the last boxes in David's apartment, he went to the window. "They won't fly with me, Sarah," he said quietly. Tom and Becky sat on the roof of the neighboring house. They looked like two cold black cutouts against the pink sunset. "They are free, David," Sarah answered, coming up behind him and hugging him. "You gave them a chance to survive, and they gave you a chance to love. The contract is closed." The move was quick. David left the keys to his old apartment with the landlord, left a final pack of butter on the table in the empty room as a sort of severance pay, and closed the door. That first night in the new house, Tom didn't fly to the windowsill. He didn't fly there on the second night, nor on the 10th. David flew. Now he was a commercial pilot, taking tourists over the coast, showing them dolphins and turquoise shoals. Life with Sarah was exactly what he had been afraid to even dream of. Peaceful, filled with laughter and shared breakfasts. But every time he flew over his old neighborhood, he involuntarily searched for black dots in the sky. He missed that grumbling, thieving creature that had once saved him from loneliness. 6 months passed. One day, David needed to pick up some documents from his old landlord. He drove to his former home. By the entrance stood a young couple, barely more than kids, maybe in their early 20s. They looked confused and a bit frightened. "Excuse me," David addressed them. "I used to live here. Are you the new tenants of apartment 4B?" The guy looked at David as if he'd seen a ghost. "Yes, we moved in 3 months ago. Listen, this sounds crazy, but maybe you know, is there some kind of weird cult around here or a magic attraction?" David frowned. "What are you talking about?" The girl took a step forward, her eyes wide with wonder. "You see, every morning a huge raven flies to our windowsill. At first we were afraid of him, but he brings money, real dollars, sometimes 5s, sometimes 20s. He puts them on the glass and taps with his beak until we open up." David's heart skipped a beat. "And what do you do?" he whispered. "We didn't understand at first," the guy replied. "And then my girlfriend accidentally left a butter sandwich on the sill. He grabbed the butter, dropped the money, and flew off. Now we always keep a spare pack in the fridge. We call it the luck tax. But it's not normal, right? Birds aren't supposed to pay rent." David looked up. On the edge of the roof, right where his favorite spot used to be, sat Tom. But he wasn't alone. Beside him, huddled wing to wing, sat Becky. And a little further away on the TV antenna, 2 small, scruffy, and absolutely black raven fledglings shifted clumsily from foot to foot. Tom noticed David. He tilted his head, let out a loud, triumphant "krrk" that echoed over the whole street and spread his mighty wings. There was no sadness in his appearance. There was only loyalty to a habit. He had found his mate. He had created his family, but he continued to bring tribute to the place he considered home. For him, there were no lease agreements or changes of ownership. For him, there was only the old ritual, money in exchange for butter, an endless cycle of gratitude. David smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt that the mechanics of the world were working perfectly. "Don't worry," he told the young people. "Just buy the better butter, farm style, salted. He's a very honest bird. He's just making sure this house can always afford breakfast." He got into the car where Sarah was waiting. He didn't tell her everything right away. He would tell her later when they were flying over the Gulf in their own plane. Because in Tampa, Florida, amazing things happen. Here, mechanics become pilots, ravens become bankers, and love always finds you if you are ready to leave the window open, even if you think that all that can fly through it is just a bird thief.